Folks, good evening. My name's Ian Robertson and I'll be chairing the meeting tonight. Just before we get started, a few wee bit of housekeeping. There is no fire alarm planned for tonight, no drill, so if the alarm goes, please leave by the exits. The toilets are out there, just outside the door on your right, and I would ask you, if you've got mobile phones with you, could you turn them off or turn them onto silent, and that would be very helpful. Thank you. Tonight, can I welcome you to which is the last public meeting in the Dumbarton and Alexandria area of this campaign. It's been a particularly long campaign, but it's been one that has allowed the Yes campaign to get boots on the ground and meet people. We've had meetings all over the Helensburgh and Lochside areas, the meetings in Gartaharn, Alexandria and Dumbarton. This is our second one in Dumbarton, and our colleagues in Clydebank have had a range of meetings too. So we've taken a step back in time and brought politics to where it should be, face to face, people to people, and that's the way it should be, something that the media haven't allowed us to do in recent years. And to be frank, it's meetings like this when you really get to know what people are thinking about. So thank you all for turning out tonight. The format for tonight's meeting is straightforward. We have 3 speakers. At the end, we'll be looking for questions from the floor. I can say that I will be a strict chair. I don't want statements from the floor. I want short, sharp questions and give the members of the panel a chance to answer them. And then we'll see where it goes from there. I know that we've all got plenty of opinions, but I think for the undecided voters, particularly those that are in the hall, and if there's any no voters in the hall, hearing answers is what they've been asking for. So the plea from me is to ask the question and let the speakers answer them. That way we'll all end up a bit more informed at the end of the evening. I think we've got a tremendous range of speakers tonight. And I'm hoping that it will satisfy the audience in terms of the things that you need to know, why we're supporting Yes. And I'm not going to say much more because I could stand here all night, but I think to kick off, I think everybody's just about in the hall now. Some seats up there in the back right if you want. There you go. It would be you, Gordon, wouldn't it? Our first speaker, and I don't want to be ageist here, but he's from the younger generation. But Graeme Sneddon is 22 years of age, which dramatically drops the average age among some of my campaign team, and I'm sure they wouldn't mind me saying that either. But I think for Graeme, he's probably of the generation who have got most to gain here in this independence debate. And I'm sure Graeme, who's a student, he's at university, has got a lot of aspirations ahead of him, and I'm quite sure his speech tonight will be about what it means for him. I'm certainly hoping that will be the case, and I'm going to invite Graeme to speak now, and could you give him a warm welcome to Denny Civic.
Thank you very much indeed, Ian, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be invited to speak to you in this. I didn't realise it was the last public meeting here in Dumbarton, so I feel very, very privileged, I have to say. I want to kind of start thinking about the kind of independence debate in the context of kind of young people's participation in politics, because one of the things that we often have heard or seen in the media is, oh, young people aren't interested in politics anymore. We've got, people like Russell Brand, although I believe he now supports a Yes vote, previously saying, no, you shouldn't bother voting in elections, and actually the figures bear that out. At the last UK general election, only 44% of young voters, first-time voters, actually cast a ballot in that election, and projecting that forward, they've done the same survey again looking ahead to 2015, and there's only going to be 41% of young voters that are actually wanting to cast a vote. So that's nearly 2/3 of young people across the UK that are basically saying this political system doesn't work. And looking at the policies that have been coming from Westminster, and indeed what I believe a no vote represents. It's no wonder young people are put off. We've seen down south the trebling of tuition fees for universities in England, Wales and Northern Ireland to £9,000. Complicit in that have been the Liberal Democrats, of course, a party that many students and young people voted for in 2010 in the hope of change. So we kind of look at this aspect of, we look at this in Westminster and kind of think, so like if people are going to say one thing and do another, then why on earth should we bother voting? And I wholeheartedly agree with that. I think looking ahead, some of the statements that have been made by the parties at Westminster have been absolutely looking at punishing people, or punishing young people in particular. We've had the Tory party saying that they want to remove housing benefit from under 25, so there's a mechanism in which young people wanting to start out and have an independent start in life are being forced to live at home with their parents. Indeed, I believe the term that's been coined is the boomerang generation for my generation, people who have gone away to university, enjoyed their time, and then have had to come back home and live with their parents because financially it's too difficult for them to put a deposit down on a flat and actually move out in life. And I think that's one of these things that really we're threatening young people's independence if we stay within the Union. So, continuing in that vein, looking at the opposition, looking at Labour, and Labour's line is, we will be tougher than the Tories. So, what a fantastic prospect that is for young people. Rachel Reeves has talked about having compulsory testing for job seekers allowance for young people as well. So, we really need to kind of consider looking at the state of Westminster is, do we want to continue under this system that seems to put young people on the scrap heap? Indeed, this was the theme actually of an advert that I saw recently online. It was a charity called Future You that said 1 million young people feel like they're on the scrap heap. That's what a no vote, I believe, represents for young people. Now, I want to kind of continue on this theme as well, because if you look at the kind of early years indicator, you look at poverty in Scotland and inequality in Scotland, within the Union, the UK has delivered the 4th most unequal society in the world. And not only does that impact on people, I feel that in terms of income, if we make a society where income equality is greater, then we'll not only have wealthier people, but we'll also have happier people, higher levels of satisfaction, quality of life. Indeed, trust in communities is actually higher in more equal countries. So we have a real opportunity for young people to get involved in their local community, but they need to gain that trust in order to do that. I feel that I have to say that only a yes vote for me will get the powers to the Scottish Parliament that we actually need to create jobs for young people in Scotland. We've already seen with devolution that higher education has been protected. Higher education has been protected. It's free in Scotland. We've had 25,000 modern apprenticeships delivered year on year under the current Scottish Government. Indeed, the Scottish Government, we also have a minister specifically for youth employment, something that's not actually been replicated anywhere else in these islands. And I think that spirit of innovation that we've started with devolution, we can continue with independence. Going back to some of the horrendous cuts that we've been seeing in welfare, one quote I was reading a bit recently, and one quote really jumped out to me. It was from Edwin Scrimgeour, who famously was the MP that famously defeated Churchill in Dundee at the 1922 general election, and he was saying of this, the Anomalies Bill, and this was a bill that Labour introduced in the 1930s to reduce unemployment at the backdrop of the Great Depression, so similar economic circumstances to which we find ourselves in just now. And what he's described this Anomalies Bill that was designed to toughen up access to the welfare state as a chase after a mouse. And I think it's been pretty clear that Westminster, or politicians at Westminster, certainly seem to spend their time chasing after mice rather than going after the fat cats that are avoiding tax on a grand scale. And one of the things I feel very privileged, I have to say, to speak at this debate tonight, because one of the things that I've enjoyed having been a part of this campaign for nearly 2 years now has been this town hall revival, seeing all these people gathering together and exchanging ideas in public meetings. Many of you indeed will be familiar with the Common Weal, which was started by Robin McAlpine of the Jimmy Reid Foundation. And one of the things that I really want to see in an independent Scotland is this idea of a citizen's income, a basic payment paid to everyone who's out of work. Not only is that important to ensure that young people are supported as they're making their early years progression, it's actually better for the benefits bill, because you save having to subsidise poverty pay, having to subsidise the amount of money that companies are actually paying out people with tax credits, which is what happens under the current UK government. And I think I would rather actually you ask me some questions at the end, so I think I'll maybe draw to a close. But one of the things that I think that independence is that young people value the ability to make decisions in their own lives and shape their own futures. And a yes vote in September, it gives us this enormous opportunity to shape the country that we live in whatever way you want to see it. So I want to close to say to young people in the audience, and to come up and ask me questions later, that we can be the generation that builds a better Scotland. Be Generation Yes. Thank you very much.
Before I introduce our next speaker, can I just say, as someone who's got 6 grandchildren now, it's very refreshing to hear someone young like Graeme speaking so eloquently and having such a great understanding of what we need to do to make our country better. And thanks very much for that. Now, our next speaker is someone who I think it's fair to say has become a bit of an internet sensation in recent months. I've seen some of the figures for some of the videos from some of the other meetings that she's appeared at, and I think there's a really good reason for that, because our principal topic, which illustrates why we need independence, is something that's very, very close to all of our hearts, and that's the NHS. The NHS touches every single one of us in this room. We all know and have people that have depended on it, and we all depend on it at different stages in our life. And if there's any single thing that I feel that's worth a vote for yes, it's the preservation of that very precious NHS system. So I'm going to invite Dr. Philippa Whitford to speak to you about her perspective on why we need a yes vote. I haven't wasted any time giving you a biography of Philippa, because it's pretty well all over the internet, and I'm sure she'll forgive me for that.
I'm very grateful for the team here in Dumbarton for inviting me tonight I've lost track of which meeting this is. My husband and I, not quite as far as Jim, but we've done 2,500 miles since that little video went viral. I'm still doing the day job as a breast surgeon, so it's all getting a wee bit tight just at the moment, but we've been to Langham in the Borders, Elgin in the north, Arran in the west, Cooper in the east, and seeing exactly this on wet Monday nights, on sunny Saturday afternoons, and amazingly on a Friday night, people coming out and sitting in town halls literally the length and breadth of this country, and it's incredible. Now, I do a lot of Women for Independence cafes, and I have to say they're a definite step up on this, because we have tables and we have tea and we have cake. So a theatre's lovely, but you're missing out. That's my kind of politics with cake. Now, one of the things that people often talk about, my journey to yes and all that kind of stuff. Well, I mean, I would have to say my journey to yes was about that much. Because in my heart, absolutely, there was no question. First time I ever voted, I voted SNP. I can't say I'm not a party political person. I've voted all sorts of people. In Westminster, I too voted for the Liberals, thinking, I agree with Nick, and look what happened. Don't agree with him now. But like most people, we still had to do the homework right at the beginning, because we've been told for so long that we are kept It was important to know that we wouldn't simply become independent and go straight down the chutes. And like other people, I was really shocked at what I found. Now obviously Business for Scotland do great meetings, they analyse the expenditure and revenue figures, and what you very quickly see as they show, for 33 years, we've been sending money down the M1. We're not kept at all. Now somebody got me figures which was from 1900 to 1921, and back there it was even more shocking. We used to send 4 times as much to Westminster as came back in the first quarter of the 20th century. And in the 50s, we sent twice as much to London as came back. Now that's long before oil. We get told, oh, we're a basket case other than for oil. That was back when the Clyde built a quarter of the world's ships. And how did the people on the Clyde live? They lived in slum tenements, the children had rickets, the adults had TV. So what did we get back? Absolutely nothing. And that really made me open my eyes up. I've seen a figure recently from them that even in the first 5 years after the crash, we have sent $8.5 billion extra to London than came back during the financial crisis. That's $1.5 billion a year. That's an extra 10% to the NHS and an extra 10% to schools. Or maybe we'd have divvied it up differently, but we never got that choice. And that's what this is about. That's all this is about. It's not about Alex Salmond, it's not about the SNP, it's not about any party. All it's about is taking control. As Jim has said before, we will have control of our country for that one day. Do we keep it or do we give it back? And that's all it's about. Are we a country or are we a region? That's what you're deciding. And the idea that we're too poor to manage it is rubbish. The idea that we're not genetically programmed to make political decisions is rubbish. I'm not even Scottish. But you guys are known around the world for inventiveness, reliability, engineering, manufacturing, and that has been taken away from us in the last 35 years. And what we've had in the last 35 years has been decisions made that we wouldn't have taken. We've been taken into wars I don't think we'd have gone. I don't think we'd have gone out to the Falklands. I certainly don't think we'd have gone into Iraq. And look at the absolute mess it is now. I worked in Gaza and Lebanon during the first Intifada, just after the first Gulf War. And I saw when we went into Iraq in 2003 that what we were sowing is the basis for what would be the next world war, is the Middle East unraveling. So that's what happened when you punch above your weight militarily. I don't think we'd have parked weapons of mass destruction just down the road from our biggest city. I don't think we'd have wasted $6 billion on building 2 aircraftless carriers. Now they say, I know they say that that's great because that keeps 6,000 jobs. 6,000, 6 billion, that's 6,000 millionaires. I'm sure quite a few of them have been quite willing to take £1 million redundancy for these 2 big hunks of metal that are not going to serve any purpose. I know that regardless of party, we wouldn't have introduced the bedroom tax. And I'm pretty certain that without more evidence, we would not have zoned the Central Belt for fracking. And we weren't even told that. We didn't even get any consultation on that. And that's what this is about. Decisions get handed to us that we either barely influence or don't even get the chance to be involved in. And that's what we have to decide. Are we big enough and ugly enough, as my mother would say, to stand on our own 2 feet and take responsibility? One of the other things we've had for over 30 years is the shipping of public resources into private hands. We saw it with the oil, when Brit Oil just got privatised to become BP. Okay, we get the taxes, we get the licences, but we don't get the oil. The clever thing the Norwegians did is they still kept a majority share in Statoil. We didn't. We just wanted the money in as quickly as possible. We did it with the power companies. We did it with rail. We subsidise rail more now that it's private than we did when it was British Rail. And I can't say that I think we get a better service. We saw the Royal Mail sold off at bargain basement prices. And now it's the turn of NHS in England. And the reason I spoke out, and that wee YouTube video was a women's cafe with cake in Straven on the 1st of May, talking to a leisure centre with about 80 women in it. And that, funnily enough, was actually my first speech like this, that someone videoed in an iPad and shoved up on YouTube, and I thought, great, I can show my mum. Yeah, my life has not been the same since. But the reason I spoke out is we were getting no media coverage whatsoever about the changes down south. Now, we could be very kind and think that the Scottish media think, well, it's not relevant, it's devolved. But the idea that what's happening in the English NHS has no bearing on our NHS, I'm afraid, is cloud cuckoo land. What has happened in the last year since the introduction? The first one is the Secretary of State in London is no longer legally responsible to ensure that every citizen in England has healthcare. That has been taken away. That comes down to these groups of GPs who are clinical commissioners. And what was slipped out in regulations rather than the Act is that every service they commission must be put out to tender between the NHS and private companies. At the end of 1 year, 70% of all contracts have gone to private companies. Now, those private companies are not actually bringing in resource or buildings or new equipment or anything else. They're simply moving in to run it. Because if you work in the NHS and your service gets contracted to the private side, well, there's now no funding to run the NHS version. So that just ceases to exist. If the private side has an alternate little private hospital, fine. Yours is just going to shut up. What actually happens, though, is that they tend to move in. They take on the buildings, they take on the staff, they take on the equipment. Stuff we paid for, stuff we invested in through tax, is handed to them, and they get to run it for a profit. Now, that can never come back, because in 5 years, when that franchise is up for renewal, well, there is no NHS hip and knee or orthopaedic service or physio service. It doesn't exist to even put a bid in. So this is a relentless movement of stuff from public NHS out to private companies. And the problem with that is the private companies want to cherry pick all the stuff that's lucrative and easy. So it's very surgically orientated, it's very outpatient-y, it's very general practice. If you're actually ill, and particularly if you have a chronic illness, they don't want to know you. So if you're diabetic, forget it. If you've had a stroke, forget it. If you have a complex cancer, forget it. If you get hit by a bus and you're in intensive care, sorry, you're on the NHS. So the NHS hospitals down south are becoming progressively more expensive for the patients they're treating. And at the end of just 1 year, 40% of them are in debt. Barts in London is more than 50 million in debt after just 1 year of these changes. The government had to put another 500 million in to bail some out, and even after that, there are another 200 million in debt. Having gone from having lived within their means the year before these changes. It's an absolute shambles. Well, any of you who work in a public service know that when a public service is in debt, what follows that? Cuts. Cuts in staff and cuts in services. And that's what we're seeing, is already the NHS in England is on its knees. One of the things I find very hard is that the whole collaborative and cooperative nature of the NHS has been destroyed. Because now the NHS hospitals are obviously in a fight for existence with the private hospitals, but they're also in a fight for existence with each other. If they have another NHS hospital nearby, they must win the contract. That is all administrators are thinking about, is how do we get the contract? because they only get paid for the patients they attract through the door. Now, at the end of all of that, with the cuts and the debts, what are they starting to talk about? They're talking about charges. Reform UK and the King's Fund have both put forward the suggestion of a £10 to £25 charge to see your general practitioner. Now, to avoid everyone not doing that and therefore rushing off to A&E, what they're saying is there'd have to be the same charge to go to accident and emergency. Now, it's been on talk shows, it's been in The Sun, it's been in lots of papers talking about, well, let's just charge drunks, because they're a real pain in the neck and casualty. It's all the thin end of the wedge. It's all about introducing the principle of charges. I thought a little bit about a phone-in that was on Radio 4, and there was people phoning in and saying, well, I would pay £10 to save the NHS. I would pay £25 to save the NHS. I'm sorry, the moment people are paying, you haven't saved the NHS. The NHS is done for. That's it. It's over. The whole basis was you don't pay. My mum's elder brother, who died before she was born, died from blood poisoning with an abscess on his neck because they couldn't afford sixpence to go to the GP. That's what it was like in the 40s. Before Aneurin Bevan said, we need to change this. When people talk about, oh, how can we change things if we get a yes vote? How can we manage? They set the NHS up 3 years after we came out of the Second World War. If you're determined, you can jolly well do anything. And I absolutely agree with David Cameron. It is one of the best things that Britain has ever done. The other thing he quoted was the welfare state. That's one of the other best things we've ever done. The problem is, they are setting about taking them apart. Now people say, well, you know, the politicians are all on slagging me off in the news and whatnot, saying, but it's devolved, this is the biggest lie ever, it's devolved, it doesn't matter. Now, I'm not talking about next year, I'm not even talking about a couple of years down the line, but 50% of NHS leaders feel charges are inevitable well under 10 years. Well, I believe in 10 years' time, when there's no cooperative NHS, when it's all run by Virgin, Atos, G4S, Care UK, when MPs have constituents lining up outside to complain about the service, you think they're just going to sign money over to us every year to sit up here quietly with our unified public NHS that we went back to since devolution, with our free prescriptions and our eye tests and our dental checks and our free personal care? You believe that if you want. I'm afraid I don't. I don't think there's any chance of that. If we think, as you said, Ian, that the NHS is important, we should want to have it under our control, totally under our control. Because we don't control it. We don't control the purse strings. We send our earnings down the road, and then we get our pocket money back every year. And our pocket money is always significantly less than what our earnings were. And if we simply worked hard, stimulate our economy, earn the money, we should get to decide how we spend it. And the big thing people have to remember is all those things I mentioned at the beginning that I think we wouldn't do. We wouldn't be spending money on that. We wouldn't be spending 100 billion on a new replacement for Trident. I don't think we'd go around and as I said, having worked in Gaza and Lebanon, I worked a lot with UN peacekeepers, but there were no Brits and there were no Yanks, because they're too much baggage. They can't work in the Middle East for the UN. But there was Finns, there was Dutch, there was Norwegians, there was Swedish, there was Swiss, and there was Irish. And I would be absolutely proud to see a Scottish Defence Force that was contributing to peace and stability in the world instead of us